They say you never know who you'll meet on the streets, and for one homeless transgender woman, a simple interaction changed everything. But what happened when the most unexpected person stopped to talk to her? Share your thoughts in the comments before the story unfolds. The weight of the backpack pressed hard against Jessica Hagen's shoulders, the straps digging into her thin frame as she shuffled through the sidewalks of Los Angeles. The city was alive with noise, honking cars, distant laughter, the occasional murmur of conversations she wasn't a part of. She walked with her head low, past towering buildings and store windows that reflected a woman she barely recognized. Jessica had always known who she was. Even before she had the words to describe it, before she had the courage to say it out loud, she knew. Transitioning had been the most liberating decision of her life, but also the most costly. The world had taken everything from her in return. Her family, her job, and now, even the simple dignity of having a place to sleep at night. She adjusted the frayed edges of her old coat, once military issued, now worn down from too many nights curled up in alleyways and bus stops. She had served her country proudly, believing that her uniform would grant her respect. But respect was a luxury that had long been stripped from her the moment she chose to live her truth. "Hey, move it!" A man brushed past her roughly, nearly knocking her to the ground. Jessica stumbled, catching herself against the edge of a lamppost. She wanted to snap back, to demand the same space in the world as anyone else, but she had learned that fighting back only brought more trouble. She exhaled sharply and continued walking. A small coffee shop at the corner caught her eye, not because she could afford anything inside, but because the warmth spilling from the open door reminded her of what comfort felt like. A group of business people sat inside, their laughter muffled through the glass. They didn't notice her. No one did. Jessica pulled her coat tighter around herself and turned away. The streets had become her home in the past year. She had lost count of how many shelters had turned her away, how many job applications had mysteriously gone unanswered. People didn't say it outright, but she saw it in their eyes, heard it in their hesitations when she handed over her ID, the subtle shift in their expressions when they read the name Jessica, but saw a past they didn't understand. She adjusted her hat, trying to make herself smaller as she walked toward a park bench where she planned to rest for a while, but just as she approached, she noticed someone standing nearby. A man dressed in an unmistakably tailored suit, his hair perfectly combed, his presence impossible to ignore. Jessica stopped in her tracks. She knew who he was immediately. Donald Trump. Her heart pounded. What was he doing here? This wasn't the kind of place billionaires wandered into. For a moment, she considered turning away, disappearing into the city like she always did when she felt out of place, but something about the way he was standing there, as if waiting for something, or someone, made her hesitate. And then, to her complete shock, he turned and looked directly at her. Jessica stiffened, instinctively bracing for the worst. She had been noticed before, never in a good way. Maybe he would tell her to get a job, throw some offhanded remark about back in his day, or worse, pretend she didn't exist like so many others. She was used to all of it. But Donald Trump didn't turn away. He didn't sneer. He didn't tell her to move. Instead, he took a step toward her. Jessica's grip tightened around the strap of her backpack. Every instinct told her to walk away, disappear into the city before anything could escalate. But something kept her there, rooted to the spot, as Trump studied her with an expression she couldn't quite place. "You a vet?" His voice was calm, lacking the usual bravado she had heard on television a million times. His gaze flicked to the patch on her tattered coat, the last remnant of her service, one she refused to let go of. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. "Marine Corps?" Trump's eyes lingered on the patch a moment longer before he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "You look like hell," he said bluntly. "You eating?" Jessica's mind raced. She had spent the past year of her life being ignored, ridiculed, spat at, or treated like she was invisible. And now, of all people, it was him standing in front of her, asking if she had eaten. She straightened her posture. "I'm fine." Trump raised an eyebrow. "That's not what I asked." Jessica clenched her jaw. She hated feeling like a charity case. Hated the way people sometimes looked at her, like a problem to be solved rather than a person. But there was something different about this. He wasn't looking at her like a politician posing for a photo op. He wasn't looking at her with disgust either. It was almost like "I get by," she said finally, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. Trump exhaled through his nose, a familiar gesture she had seen on television countless times. Then, without another word, he turned and started walking away. Jessica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was it. Whatever curiosity had made him stop and acknowledge her, it had passed. She was just another stranger on the street again. But then he stopped. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, motioning for her to follow. Jessica frowned. What? You coming or not? Her feet felt like they were cemented to the sidewalk. Where? Dinner, he said simply. You eat or you stand there and freeze. Up to you. Jessica stared at him. This had to be some kind of joke, maybe a setup, someone waiting around the corner with a camera to film her reaction, put it online for everyone to laugh at the homeless transgender woman trailing after the former president. But the alternative was standing there, stomach empty, night closing in, knowing that if she said no, she'd regret it later. Against her better judgment, she took a step forward. Then another. Trump didn't say anything as they walked. They moved through the crowded sidewalks, past people who didn't even glance in their direction. Jessica was hyper-aware of every set of eyes that did flicker toward them, though. It wasn't every day you saw a man like him walking side by side with someone like her. The neon lights of a nearby diner came into view. It wasn't the kind of place Jessica ever walked into anymore. Places like this didn't welcome people like her, not just because she was homeless, but because of who she was. She had been chased out of enough stores and restaurants to know the look that was coming as soon as she stepped inside. Sure enough, the hostess' smile faltered the moment she spotted Jessica. Her eyes swept over the frayed coat, the worn-out jeans, the tired face. Jessica could see the words forming on her lips, the polite way she was about to ask them to leave, to find somewhere else to go. Then Trump stepped in front of her. Table for two. The hostess' mouth snapped shut. She blinked up at him, eyes darting between him and Jessica, as if trying to make sense of the situation. Right away, sir. Jessica's hands curled into fists at her sides. She hated that it took a man like him to get her through the door, hated that people still needed a reason to treat her like a human being. But for now, she bit her tongue and followed him to a booth near the back of the restaurant. She sat stiffly, her hands resting in her lap. Across from her, Trump grabbed a menu, flipping it open like this was just another normal night, like they weren't the strangest pairing in this entire city. Jessica didn't bother opening her own menu. She knew she wasn't ordering anything over a few dollars. The waitress arrived, her eyes flickering toward Jessica before settling on Trump with a forced smile. What can I get you? Trump didn't hesitate. Steak, medium rare, baked potato. He closed the menu and glanced at Jessica and whatever she wants. Jessica hesitated, then murmured, just coffee. Trump frowned. Get something real. I'm fine. Didn't ask if you were fine. Jessica clenched her jaw, but the hunger gnawing at her ribs won. She exhaled sharply and finally muttered, burger, fries. The waitress scribbled down the order and left. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jessica stared down at the table, fingers tracing invisible patterns against the scratched-up surface. Trump finally leaned back in the booth, arms crossed. What's your story? Jessica looked up at him. You mean, why am I here or why am I like this? His expression didn't change. Both. Jessica swallowed hard. She didn't talk about it, not to strangers, not even to herself half the time. But something about the way he asked, blunt, without pity, made her hesitate. She could lie, tell him it was bad luck, that she had just fallen on hard times, nothing more. Or she could tell the truth. Jessica took a breath. I knew I was trans since I was a kid, she said, voice low. Didn't have the words for it, not back then. Just knew something wasn't right. But I kept my head down, did what I was supposed to do, joined the Marines because I thought, maybe if I was strong enough, disciplined enough, I could be who I was supposed to be. Joe, Trump didn't interrupt. Jessica's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Turns out the only thing I ever learned in the military was how to hide. She forced out a dry laugh, and how to survive, at least until I stopped hiding. Trump's gaze was unreadable. Jessica shrugged, forcing the tension out of her shoulders. That's the short version, anyway. The waitress returned with their food, setting the plates down between them. The smell of hot fries made Jessica's stomach tighten painfully, but she waited. Trump picked up his fork, then nodded at her plate. Eat. Jessica hesitated. Then, for the first time in a long time, she picked up the burger and took a bite. Jessica barely remembered the last time she had eaten a full meal at a table like this. The sensation of warm food filling her stomach was almost unsettling. Like her body had forgotten how to accept something other than stale crackers and whatever canned goods the shelters had left over. Across from her, Trump ate in silence, his knife and fork moving with a precision she had only ever seen in politicians and businessmen. He didn't stare at her, didn't ask if she needed anything else, didn't try to make conversation while she ate. She appreciated that more than she expected. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with a thin napkin and leaned back slightly, her fingers wrapping around the warm coffee mug in front of her. She should have left already. She didn't belong here, sitting across from a man who had once signed policies that erased protections for people like her, who had made headlines for banning trans troops from the military, the same institution that had both saved her and ruined her. But she was still here. "Where are you staying?" Trump finally asked, cutting through the noise of the diner. Jessica snorted softly. "Wherever the cops aren't kicking me out of." He didn't react. He just nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. Jessica tapped her fingers against the mug, watching him. "Why are you doing this?" Trump set down his fork and wiped his mouth with his napkin before looking at her directly. "You're a veteran." Jessica gave a dry laugh. "So? Plenty of vets are out here. Doesn't mean people care." "I do." She stared at him, waiting for the punchline. But there wasn't one. Jessica leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Do you, though? Because last I checked, guys like me, transgender people, we weren't exactly your priority." Trump didn't flinch, didn't look away. "People change." Jessica narrowed her eyes. "Do they?" A long pause settled between them. Then, to her surprise, Trump leaned back in his seat and exhaled slowly. "I don't like being wrong," he admitted. Jessica raised an eyebrow. And I think I was." Jessica's hands tightened around the coffee mug, the warmth grounding her, steadying her against the sudden rush of emotions she didn't want to feel. "You don't have to say that," she muttered. Trump's gaze didn't waver. "I don't have to do a lot of things." Jessica let out a slow breath, forcing herself to process what was happening. She had spent years being talked down to, being treated like a burden, a mistake, an inconvenience. She had built walls so high that nothing, not kindness, not sympathy, not even generosity, could slip through. And yet here she was, sitting in a diner, talking to a man she had once considered an enemy, realizing she had no idea what to make of him. Trump signaled the waitress and handed her a credit card without looking at the bill. Jessica watched as the woman nodded, her face still twisted with the kind of confusion that only came from trying to process a scene that didn't make sense. When the receipt was signed and the plates cleared, Trump stood up, slipping his wallet back into his jacket. Jessica hesitated before following suit. As they stepped outside, the night air hit her like a slap. Sharp, cold, real. The world outside hadn't changed just because she had sat down to dinner with someone powerful. She was still homeless. She was still struggling. And yet something was different. Trump walked ahead a few steps, then stopped, turning back to face her. "Come on." Jessica frowned. "Where?" "I've got a place for you to stay." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, just like that?" He shrugged. "Unless you'd rather sleep in an alley." Jessica's first instinct was to reject it, to tell him she didn't need his help, that she had survived this long on her own. But that was a lie. She was exhausted. She was tired of pretending she had it all figured out. "How do I know this isn't some kind of PR stunt?" she finally asked. Trump smirked. "You think I want cameras on me for this?" Jessica studied him carefully. She didn't trust people. That was a lesson she had learned the hard way. But at this moment, standing under the neon glow of the diner sign, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Without another word, she followed him. The black SUV waiting at the curb was exactly what she expected. Sleek, expensive, the kind of car that had tinted windows to keep the world from looking inside. Jessica hesitated before opening the door. She had always hated cars like this. They reminded her of all the things she would never have. Trump slid into the seat beside her, adjusting his tie as the driver pulled into the street. Jessica sat rigid, her hands resting on her lap, trying to ignore the way the leather seats felt too smooth, too foreign beneath her. They drove in silence for a while, the city passing by in a blur of streetlights and storefronts. Jessica finally broke the silence. You said people change. Trump glanced at her. She turned to face him fully. What changed you? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, life. Jessica studied his face, searching for something, some sign that this was a game, a performance, but he looked tired, like a man who had spent too much time carrying the weight of his own choices. Jessica exhaled and looked out the window. I don't know if I believe you. Trump smirked. You don't have to. The car pulled up in front of a hotel, the kind of place Jessica hadn't stepped foot in since before she lost everything. The driver got out, opening the door for her. Jessica didn't move. Trump looked at her. What? She bit her lip, shifting in her seat. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing, it was everything. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't being left behind. Jessica stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the hotel. The warm glow from the lobby window spilled onto the pavement, stretching toward her like an invitation she wasn't sure she could accept. Places like this weren't meant for people like her. She had spent so many nights being told to move along, so many days feeling the eyes of hotel staff on her, waiting for the moment she stepped too close so they could shut the door before she even reached it. But tonight the door was already open. Trump had already stepped inside, barely giving the entrance a second thought. She hesitated only a moment longer before taking a deep breath and following him. The lobby was bright, polished, pristine, the kind of clean that felt unnatural to her now, the kind of place that had never made space for a homeless, transgender woman who barely had $2 in her pocket. She felt the weight of the receptionist's stare before she even looked up. The young woman behind the desk took one glance at Jessica's worn-out coat, the tattered backpack slung over her shoulder, and Jessica could already see the refusal forming on her lips. Jessica braced for it. The hushed whispers, the security call, the way people pretended they had rules when all they really had were biases. But then Trump spoke. Room for the night. The receptionist blinked. Excuse me? He pulled out his wallet, sliding a black card across the counter like it was the simplest thing in the world. Make it 2 nights, whatever she needs. The woman hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Jessica saw the conflict flicker across her face. The way her instincts screamed to deny service, but her job told her she couldn't refuse this man standing in front of her. Of course, sir. Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. She had been turned away so many times she had forgotten what it felt like to be allowed in. A key card was handed over. Trump took it without fanfare and turned back to Jessica, holding it out for her to take. She hesitated before reaching for it, the small piece of plastic suddenly feeling heavier than it should have. The words caught in her throat. I don't know what to say. Trump shrugged. You don't have to say anything. Jessica clenched her fingers around the key card, the edges digging into her palm. She had spent so long fighting for scraps, proving she was worth basic human decency. She didn't know how to accept something without a catch. You sure this isn't a PR stunt? She asked, her voice laced with the familiar edge of distrust. Trump smirked. If it was, I'd have cameras here. Jessica exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. You really don't make sense. Neither do you, he shot back. A silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when two people realized they were standing in a moment they never could have predicted. Jessica shifted on her feet. I don't do well with favors. Feels like I gotta pay him back somehow. Trump nodded as if he understood. Then pay it forward. Jessica scoffed. With what? My endless resources? She gestured down at her clothes. You think the world's been handing me things to pass on? Trump didn't waver. You've survived. Figure it out. Jessica looked away, her gaze landing on the hotel entrance. She had survived. Barely. And the truth was, she had spent so much time just trying to make it through the next day, she had forgotten how to think about the future. She forced out a breath. Fine, she muttered. I'll take the room. Trump gave a small nod. Good. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the elevator, leaving her standing in the lobby, gripping the keycard like a lifeline. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just stood there, the hum of distant conversation and the faint clink of glasses from the hotel bar, reminding her that she was in a world she hadn't belonged to in a long time. Then slowly she walked toward the elevator, pressing the button and stepping inside, When the doors slid open, she watched the numbers climb. The room was bigger than any space she had been allowed to call her own in years. A neatly made bed, a desk, a bathroom with a mirror she almost didn't want to look into. She dropped her bag on the floor, staring at the bed like it was a mirage, something her mind had conjured just to tease her. For the first time in years, she let herself sit on something soft, something that wasn't concrete or a shelter cot with too many bodies crammed together. The mattress sank slightly beneath her weight, and something in her chest twisted. This was temporary. She reminded herself of that. No matter how comfortable the bed felt beneath her fingertips, no matter how warm the air was, this wasn't her life. It was borrowed. A favor. She lay back, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was loud, too loud. It cycled through the past, through the memories of losing everything, of every rejection, every moment someone had told her she wasn't enough. Not as a soldier, not as a woman, not as a person. And now she was in a hotel room because Donald frickin' Trump decided to help her. She wanted to laugh, to scream, to cry. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion pull her under. For the first time in a long time, she slept without fear. The knock on the door came just as Jessica stirred awake. For a moment, she didn't move. Her mind, still foggy from the deepest sleep she had allowed herself in years, struggled to piece together where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. The sheets wrapped around her body were too soft, too clean. The distant hum of air conditioning replaced the usual sound of passing cars and distant sirens. And then she remembered. She was in a hotel room. A real one, not a shelter, not a bench, not an overpass where she had to sleep with one eye open. And all of it, the bed, the warmth, the safety, had come from the most unexpected person. Another knock. Jessica groaned, pushing herself upright. The soreness in her limbs wasn't from sleeping on concrete for once, but from something else entirely, something she wasn't sure how to name. She hesitated before swinging her legs over the side of the bed, feet sinking into the plush carpet. It was absurd, really, how foreign that sensation was to her, how something as simple as stepping onto carpet made her feel like she was trespassing. She ran a hand through her messy hair and moved toward the door. And when she opened it, Trump stood there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Jessica blinked. I wasn't expecting room service. Trump smirked. Figured you were still alive. That's a start. She stepped back, motioning for him to enter. He did, glancing around the room like he was inspecting it, as if he needed to confirm she hadn't trashed the place or disappeared in the middle of the night. Jessica folded her arms, watching him carefully. So, what's the deal? Trump turned to her, raising a brow. The deal? She motioned vaguely toward the room, toward herself, the hotel, the food, the sudden, I don't know, interest? You don't exactly have a reputation for helping people like me. Trump studied her for a long moment. You're not people like you. Jessica scoffed. Oh, I'm pretty sure I am. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're a veteran. Jessica stiffened. And I'm trans. Kind of a package deal in case you missed it. Trump didn't flinch, didn't look away. I didn't miss it. Jessica tilted her head. Then what? You wake up and suddenly decide we're worth something? Trump's jaw tightened. I woke up and decided I don't like watching people who serve this country get treated like garbage. Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's rich coming from you. Trump didn't react. He just let her words hang between them, thick and heavy. Jessica ran a hand over her face. She was too tired for this. Too tired to keep pushing away whatever the hell this was. What do you want from me? She finally asked. Trump was quiet for a moment before he spoke. A choice? Jessica frowned. A choice? He stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket. A small, neatly folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She hesitated before taking it, unfolding it with cautious fingers. Her eyes scanned the words, her breath catching in her throat. It was a contact, a name, an organization. Jessica swallowed hard. What is this? Trump shrugged. People who help, job training, housing, real help, not just a handout. Jessica's grip tightened on the paper. And why would you give me this? Trump met her gaze. Because I want to see if you'll take it. Jessica's mind raced. This was real. more real than anything she had been offered in years, the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. But it also scared her. Because taking it meant believing in something, believing that maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't doomed to be what it had been for the last few years. She exhaled slowly, staring at the paper in her hand. And if I, Trump smirked, then you wasted a perfectly good hotel room. Jessica let out a soft laugh despite herself. She looked back down at the paper, running her thumb over the name printed at the top. For the first time in years, she had a decision to make. And for the first time in years, she wasn't making it alone. Jessica sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the paper in her hand like it held the weight of the world. The ink was crisp, the letters too perfect, too official, like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't spent the last few years fighting to exist. A job program, housing assistance, real help. It sounded too good to be true. She had spent so long learning not to trust, learning that kindness often came with strings attached. People saw a transgender woman on the streets and either looked the other way or tossed some pity her way before moving on with their comfortable lives. But this wasn't just pity. It was an option. Trump watched her from where he stood by the window, arms crossed, waiting. Not pushing, not demanding, just waiting. Jessica exhaled through her nose. You really expect me to believe that I can just start over? Trump tilted his head. Why not? She scoffed. Because life doesn't work like that. You don't just snap your fingers and suddenly everything is fine. Trump smirked. No one said it'd be fine. Jessica clenched her jaw. You don't get it. His smirk faded. Then make me. Jessica inhaled sharply, shaking her head. Even if I take this so-called help, what then? I walk into a job interview and the second they see my ID, I get that look. I find an apartment and suddenly the paperwork gets lost. People like me don't just start over. We fight for every damn inch, and half the time we still lose. Trump didn't say anything at first, just watched her with that same unreadable expression, the one that made her feel like she was being measured, weighed. Then he finally spoke, so fight for the inch. Jessica narrowed her eyes. What? Trump stepped closer. You said it yourself. People like you fight, so fight. Take the help, take the damn job, prove them wrong. Jessica's grip on the paper tightened. And if I fail? And Trump smirked. Then you try again. She let out a breath, her heart pounding. This man, this impossible, ridiculous, powerful man, was standing in front of her, telling her something she had never expected to hear from him. That she was worth something. Jessica stared at the paper again, and then slowly she folded it and tucked it into her pocket. Trump nodded. Good. Jessica stood, straightening her coat. So, what now? You just walk away? Trump shrugged. Not my choice. Yours. Jessica rolled her eyes. Right. Because you're suddenly the guy who lets other people have control. Trump chuckled. I'm full of surprises. Jessica studied him for a moment, the disbelief still lingering. But there was something else now, too, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She shook her head with a small smirk. You're not what I expected. Trump smirked back. Neither are you. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then, without another word, Trump turned toward the door. Jessica's chest tightened as she watched him walk away. She had spent so much of her life expecting rejection, expecting doors to close, and now, for the first time, one was being left open. Jessica exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if this program would change her life, if this was really the fresh start she had convinced herself wasn't possible. But she knew one thing. She was going to try. She had spent too long surviving. Maybe now it was time to live.